Take a look at a map of Australia. Roughly 85% of the population lives along the coast. That's where the major cities, jobs, and nearly all of the country's infrastructure are concentrated. Then there's the Outback, an enormous, largely empty wilderness. And right now, Australia is pouring more than $1 billion into paving a road that'll stretch for thousands of miles through it. What for? For one thing, so that airplanes can land there. Seriously, a plane will approach, touch down on a highway in the middle of the desert with virtually nothing and no one nearby, carry out its mission, and then take off again. Sounds crazy, but that's only one reason for the project. The pavement's also needed to reach the immense mineral wealth hidden deep in the interior. The region is essentially a treasure trove. But without reliable roads, much of it remains cut off from the outside world. At the same time, Australia hopes this desert highway will help solve a biological problem on a massive scale. The new route will reduce travel times for livestock, meaning the animals won't lose as much weight in transit. Still, none of that seems quite enough to justify spending more than $1 billion on a highway that appears to lead from nowhere to nowhere. And in fact, those benefits are almost secondary. At its core, the project's about creating a strategic lifeline in the event of a military conflict. In other words, this is one of Australia's most important infrastructure projects in recent years. Today, we're taking a closer look at what's really going on out there and why Australians simply can't do without this highway through the desert. So we have this incredibly long road running through the middle of nowhere in Australia. How did anyone even come up with the idea? Originally, it was a patchwork of old dirt roads, abandoned cattle tracks, and indigenous routes that had crossed this unforgiving desert for centuries. Everything changed in the late 1990s, 1997 to be exact. That year, leaders from several extremely isolated outback communities got together and decided to combine all these scattered, battered tracks into a single official transport corridor. That was how the Outback Way project was born. They set up a dedicated development council and began relentlessly lobbying the federal government, spending years fighting for grants and funding. The route was pieced together from several completely different roads. In Western Australia, it followed the Great Central Road, while in Queensland, it incorporated the old Donahue Highway. They managed to connect it all, but calling it a road was being quite generous. Originally, it was little more than a wild dirt track, more than 1,000 miles of brutal off-road driving. And the lack of pavement wasn't even the worst part. Much of the road is covered in a fine, treacherous substance that local truckers call bull dust. It's essentially powder, as fine and invasive as flour. Step into it, and your boot can sink straight through as though you'd stepped into water with almost no resistance at all. When a heavy truck drives through it, the dust erupts into a massive orange cloud that can hang in the air for hours. It doesn't settle. It can clog the powerful air filters of diesel engines in no time. It seeps into virtually every gap and crevice, acting like sandpaper and slowly grinding machinery to pieces. But the most dangerous thing about bull dust is that it provides perfect camouflage. It completely fills enormous potholes and craters in the road. The surface may look perfectly flat until a wheel suddenly crashes into a hidden hole the size of a bathtub. The impact can tear the suspension off a multi-ton truck, taking part of the frame with it. And it gets worse. Constant winds combined with the occasional passage of heavily loaded vehicles turn the sandy surface into a giant washboard. The vibrations can become so violent that bolts literally shake loose and fly off. Driving across this terrain with valuable cargo means deliberately destroying your vehicle, shredding your tires, and putting your life at risk. That raises an obvious question. Why not simply fix the road with a grader? Why launch a $1.2 billion project? Well, graders are used here, but their work never lasts. They smooth the road for passing vehicles, but within a couple of weeks, the wind and the weight of the heavy trucks have torn it up all over again. That's why a completely different solution's needed. Construction crews are effectively rebuilding the highway from the ground up. You can't simply pour liquid asphalt over loose sand. First, workers remove the unstable topsoil. Then they bring in stronger material, spread it across the surface, and compact it thoroughly using heavy machinery. Instead of a dangerous, unpredictable track that's constantly being destroyed by powerful winds and truck traffic, drivers finally get a solid, durable highway. But even that still doesn't sound like a $1.2 billion project. So what else is really going on? The problem is that building anything out here means working in total isolation. In summer, temperatures routinely soar past 104 degrees Fahrenheit. The metal surfaces of construction equipment become so scorching hot that workers can burn their hands even through protective gloves. And if a component on an excavator breaks, There's no running to the nearest parts store. The closest proper town with heavy equipment spares may be more than 600 miles away. Transporting construction materials out here defies every conventional approach. To build the base beneath the asphalt, you need crushed stone. But hauling it in by dump truck from coastal quarries would burn so much diesel that the project would become ruinously expensive. Instead, construction crews bring enormous mobile tracked crushers right into the desert. These roaring machines crawl slowly across the wasteland, grinding local rock into usable aggregate and producing the necessary building material right on site. But the most absurd challenge is, strangely enough, water. To create a durable foundation for the asphalt, layer after layer of crushed rock and soil must be thoroughly soaked and then compressed by massive multi-ton rollers. Without enough water, the dust and stone won't bind together, and the expensive new road will crumble beneath the wheels of the first heavy truck that drives over it. So where do you find thousands of tons of industrial water in a completely dry desert? Engineers have to bring in drilling rigs and sink deep artesian wells all along the route. They drill through hundreds of feet of dry rock to reach ancient underground reserves within the Great Artesian Basin. Giant pumps then draw the water to the surface for the sole purpose of mixing and compacting the roadbed. It requires an enormous amount of energy, time, and money. They aren't just building the road at ground level, they're elevating it on massive high embankments so it resembles a giant protective levee. And that's clearly not just an aesthetic choice. You'd think the biggest problem in a desert would be the relentless drought. Rain's extremely rare here, and some areas can go years without seeing a single drop. But when powerful weather patterns such as La Niña settle over Australia and the wet season arrives, something extraordinary happens. The sun-baked, rock-hard ground simply refuses to absorb the water. It becomes almost completely impermeable. As a result, enormous volumes of tropical rainfall don't seep into the soil. Instead, they race across the almost perfectly flat landscape. Within hours, the desert can turn into a vast inland sea. Areas the size of an entire European country disappear beneath the water. Historically, sections of the Outback Way have had to remain completely closed for months at a time. The unpaved road would soften into thick, sticky mud before vanishing beneath 3 feet of murky floodwater. Vehicles could become trapped almost up to their windows. That's why such a large share of the project's budget isn't being spent on the smooth asphalt itself, but on massive earthworks. Engineers are raising the highway roughly 3 to 6 feet above the surrounding terrain and installing hundreds of enormous concrete culverts and drainage systems beneath it. In short, they're turning the road into a truly all-weather route, allowing floodwater to flow freely beneath the asphalt without washing away its foundations. It's a relentless battle against the elements, and every reinforced concrete culvert costs a fortune. This is where another key part of the modernization kicks in. Along certain straight sections, construction crews suddenly make the roadway much wider than usual. They clear the surrounding area of poles and signs and paint unusual markings directly onto the pavement. There's one reason for all this: to turn the highway into a runway for planes. The problem is that medical care in Central Australia is extremely limited. There are no hospitals with modern equipment for hundreds of miles. If something serious happens, like a major car crash or a sudden case of appendicitis, an ambulance from the nearest town simply won't get there in time. The journey would take far too many hours, even at full speed on a newly paved road. In these life or death situations, locals and tourists have only one real hope: the legendary Royal Flying Doctor Service. For decades, its pilots and medical teams have been saving lives across the outback using small, highly maneuverable aircraft. Before the highway was upgraded, however, they often had to land on basic dirt airstrips near isolated farms and cattle stations, and every landing came with serious risks. In summer, the aircraft's wheels kicked up enormous clouds of red dust, forcing pilots to land almost blind, while fine sand clogged the engines. During the rainy season, the airstrips turned into impassable mud. A plane could easily become bogged down. The new road solves this problem entirely. These widened sections of pavement are officially designated emergency runways. There's no dust, the surface remains firm, and an effective drainage system prevents water from pooling. An aircraft can land safely, the medical team can collect the patient, and the plane can take off again for the hospital. For the few people who live in the desert, this stretch of asphalt isn't just a convenience, it's their best chance of surviving an emergency. In other words, upgrading the road brings enormous benefits. And they don't end there, because a proper paved highway is also the key to unlocking what lies hidden in the heart of the country. What we're talking about here is a gigantic underground treasure trove. Most people picture the heart of Australia as a lifeless red desert with absolutely nothing in it. But beneath that dry, barren ground lies an astonishing amount of wealth. They mine gold, copper, uranium, and critically important rare earth metals such as neodymium, which are essential for making modern smartphones and batteries. At the western end of this route lies the small town of Laverton, Australia's major gold mining hub. Not far away is the enormous Gruyere gold mine, which produces hundreds of thousands of ounces of gold every year. Farther toward the center of the country, near Alice Springs, development's well underway on the Nolans Project, a massive deposit containing those same critically important rare earth elements. All of these mines and open-pit operations are located far from major cities, ports, and supply centers. To keep them running, operators must constantly transport huge quantities of heavy machinery, spare parts, construction materials, and hundreds of thousands of gallons of diesel for their enormous mining trucks. Most of these supplies are hauled in by Australia's famous road trains. Those are massive trucks pulling 3 or 4 trailers. Some stretch nearly 165 feet from end to end and weigh well over 100 tons. Now imagine one of these 165-foot monsters trying to crawl along a badly damaged dirt road. The rough surface doesn't just destroy the suspension, sharp rocks can tear the enormous tires to pieces. And replacing one of those tires is nothing like changing a spare on an ordinary car. The costs are astronomical. But the weather poses an even greater problem. After one heavy downpour, this dirt road turns into a muddy mess almost instantly, and the authorities shut it down. Sometimes it's closed for a couple of days, other times for weeks. For the mine, that's a disaster. If fuel deliveries get stuck, the entire operation grinds to a halt, costing millions of dollars in losses. A proper paved road solves this problem once and for all. It turns the route into an all-weather highway. Road trains can run back and forth 24 hours a day, 365 days a year without constantly checking the forecast or wasting hours crawling over ruts and potholes. Companies get reliable, predictable logistics while the government collects more tax revenue. So pouring money into this highway isn't charity, it's a straightforward business investment that pays for itself with every additional trip. Of course, all that heavy machinery and the chunks of gold ore bouncing around in the back don't particularly care how rough the road is, but for another massive and critically important Australian industry, the endless vibration turned out to be a serious problem that urgently needed fixing. The Outback is home to some truly enormous cattle stations. To put their scale into perspective, some of these properties cover more land than entire European countries, such as Belgium. Millions of cattle graze across these vast open ranges, and once the animals are fully grown, ranchers somehow have to transport them to major markets or coastal ports for export. They aren't moved in small livestock trailers either. They travel in gigantic multi-level cattle trucks, powerful road trains carrying hundreds of animals on several decks. Now put it all together. A massive multi-ton truck, hundreds of cattle packed inside, and that same badly rutted dirt road we talked about earlier. For the animals, the journey becomes a living nightmare. Cattle spend the entire trip standing up. When the truck spends hours bouncing over hard corrugations, rocks, and deep ruts, the animals experience extreme stress. To avoid falling and injuring themselves or one another when the truck hits another vicious bump, they have to tense their muscles every second of the journey just to stay balanced. Combined with the intense heat and psychological stress, that constant physical strain causes them to lose weight rapidly. In the meat industry, there's actually an official term for this, and it's a crucial one: shrinkage. Research shows that during a single journey over rough dirt roads, cattle can lose between 6 and 10% of their body weight. That means a rancher can effectively lose several tons of saleable beef on every trip. With beef prices as high as they are today, that can translate into thousands of dollars in losses from a single truckload. Once the Outback Way is fully sealed with smooth pavement, the problem largely disappears. On an even road surface, the road train moves far more smoothly. The cattle stay calmly on their feet instead of panicking or wasting energy trying to balance over rough terrain, so they arrive at the coast in good condition. Farmers keep every dollar they're entitled to, and the whole journey is far more humane. Now let's go back to the map. Remember how I said at the beginning that 85% of Australia's population lives along the coast? Well, that's also where the companies are. In fact, that's where pretty much everything is. And all of it needs to move from place to place every now and then. So how do you get from point A to point B? Well, there's Highway 1, a giant loop that runs all the way around Australia. You can start in Brisbane and follow the coast all the way to Perth. It's certainly scenic, but it comes at a price: thousands of extra miles, additional days on the road, and enormous diesel bills. Paving the Outback Way creates a direct all-weather transcontinental shortcut running from Winton to Laverton via Alice Springs. The route cuts straight through the continent and reduces the distance between the east and west coasts by nearly 600 miles. For logistics companies, the savings are obvious. Fewer days on the road, dramatically less wear and tear on truck engines, and tons of fuel saved on every trip. And there's yet another reason to welcome the road upgrade. Have you ever heard of the isolation tax? It may sound like some dull economic term, but for the people who live here, it's a harsh everyday reality. Scattered along this enormous route are tiny settlements and Aboriginal Australian communities. Take Warburton, for example, a community located quite literally in the middle of nowhere along the Great Central Road. Only a few hundred people live there. Now imagine walking into the town's only store to pick up a few basic groceries for dinner and nearly falling over when you see the prices. According to official government reports, staple foods in remote communities like these cost an average of 40 to 50% more, and sometimes as much as 80% more than they do in major coastal cities such as Sydney or Perth. A carton of milk or a fresh loaf of bread can cost 2 or even 3 times the usual price. Fresh tomatoes, apples, and bananas become luxury items, and it's not as though they arrive in perfect condition. After hours of brutal bouncing along unpaved roads, many of the fruits and vegetables reach the shelves badly bruised, partly rotten, or reduced to mush. Why does this happen? Because getting supplies into these areas is a logistical nightmare. Freight companies add a huge risk surcharge to their delivery costs, sometimes referred to as a freight penalty. A truck driver knows perfectly well that heading out along a badly damaged gravel road means almost certainly wrecking the suspension, blowing a couple of tires, or if heavy rains arrive, getting stranded in the desert for days. In the end, every one of those repair costs and risks is passed directly on to ordinary shoppers. But once the Outback Way is covered with smooth, reliable pavement, this outrageous isolation tax finally begins to break down. Truckers can carry freight in regular vehicles without worrying about losing a wheel in the first pothole. Travel times are cut dramatically, which means perishable food can reach remote stores while it's still fresh. Delivery costs fall, and prices on the shelves finally begin to come down. But does that mean everyone will immediately stop using Highway 1? Of course, some people will continue to take that route, but honestly, its days may be numbered. Highway 1 hugs the coastline, and in recent years, Australia's coastal regions have become increasingly unstable. Nature has handed the country a challenge its aging road network simply wasn't built to handle. Whenever a powerful cyclone or an extreme flood hits the coast, entire sections of Highway 1 can be washed away. Just think of the devastating floods of recent years, when parts of southern and western Australia received 6 months' worth of rain in a single day. The result was that the legendary Eyre Highway and the crucial railway line across the Nullarbor Plain disappeared beneath more than 3 feet of water. The vast state of Western Australia, along with the multi-million-person city of Perth, was completely cut off from the rest of the continent. Supermarket shelves emptied almost immediately, and major grocery chains were forced to introduce strict purchase limits on basic goods such as milk, meat, and toilet paper, just like the worst days of the pandemic. And you know what was happening to truck drivers coming from Eastern Australia, from cities such as Sydney and Melbourne at that very moment? To get their cargo to Perth, road train drivers had to turn around and make an absurd detour of 1,200 or even 1,900 miles. They were forced to reroute through South Australia and Alice Springs, adding several exhausting days to the journey simply to deliver something as ordinary as bread. At times like these, the economy loses enormous amounts of money and the entire logistics system descends into chaos. And this is exactly where the upgraded Outback Way begins to show its true potential. The road isn't being built along the coast, but deep in the dry interior of the continent. The Outback is also vulnerable to sudden flooding, of course, but as we've already seen, the new pavement's being deliberately raised on massive rock embankments and equipped with hundreds of drainage culverts. The highway's being designed to withstand major flooding far more effectively. As a result, the Outback Way is becoming a genuine backup logistics backbone for the entire country. The next time a storm washes away Highway 1 or coastal flooding shuts it down, truckers will no longer have to drive thousands of extra miles around the continent. They'll simply turn inland and travel straight across the country on smooth, dry pavement. Store shelves will remain stocked, factories won't grind to a halt, and food prices won't skyrocket because of a transportation collapse. The strategic role of this inland route's even been acknowledged by Australia's Department of Defence. Officials have stated that the road could become a lifeline during major emergencies and not only natural disasters. Australia's coastal infrastructure is extremely vulnerable in the event of a major conflict. Ports and coastal ring roads could be blocked or disabled from the sea by submarines or long-range missiles. If the country's main coastal transport arteries were cut off by an enemy, the military would struggle to respond quickly to emerging threats. But with a fully paved Outback Way hidden deep in the desert, commanders would gain an uninterrupted, secure overland corridor under their control. The military would be able to rapidly move huge convoys of armored vehicles, thousands of troops, artillery, and strategic reserves of aviation fuel from eastern bases to the vulnerable western frontier. And the most elegant part of the plan is that this massive redeployment would take place deep inside the country, safely beyond the reach of direct threats coming from the ocean. So what's the bottom line? An initial price tag of $1.2 billion sounds terrifying for an empty highway cutting through a lifeless desert. At first, critics and opposition politicians were practically screaming in unison that it was nothing more than a senseless waste of taxpayer money, billions being buried in the sand for the sake of publicity. But then independent economists and analysts sat down, crunched the numbers, and carefully calculated the long-term impact of this massive infrastructure project. The results silenced the critics. The analysts factored in the enormous daily savings on diesel fuel and expensive replacement parts for logistics companies. They accounted for cattle transportation and the sharp increase in tax revenue from mines that can now operate without constant disruptions. They calculated the multi-million-dollar boost to domestic tourism and the dramatic reduction in living costs for remote local communities. And it turned out that these billion-dollar investments in asphalt would pay for themselves several times over within the first few decades. The highway sets off a genuine macroeconomic domino effect. Every dollar invested generates $3 in economic returns by accelerating entire industries that had previously been choking and grinding to a halt because of primitive, impassable roads. Sounds impressive, doesn't it? Now all that's left is to wait for the modernization project to finally be completed. As of 2026, the project's in full swing. Paving work is moving ahead almost nonstop, with massive construction machines advancing toward one another from 3 different states and territories: Western Australia, the Northern Territory, and Queensland. Yes, the project still faces regular delays caused by soaring material costs and extreme heat, but the government machine shows no sign of stopping. Authorities remain firmly committed to paving the last remaining dirt sections by the end of the decade. Before long, this vast and ambitious transcontinental route will finally join into one continuous ribbon of smooth pavement. And when the last mile is ceremonially sealed with asphalt, the era of the old, wild, and impassable Outback, the place that terrified travelers for centuries, will disappear into the history books forever.